All right, so we're here to talk about Frank Herbert's Dune Book 2. Now, it is my understanding that JP hasn't read very much.
I'm behind right now.
Yes.
I'm gonna catch up.
That's okay. Well, Book 3 is actually very short compared to the rest of them, so you should have time to catch up this week. But Nick, did you end up getting to read all of it?
I did, yeah. Listened to all of it, and I thought there obviously wasn't as much character building and story building in Book 2 as in the first book, because obviously you had to basically create the world in Book 1. But I thought Book 2, I actually liked it more than Book 1.
Yeah, because you kind of understand the world a little bit more. You kind of know what's going on. And although there's a decent amount of action in Book 1, especially towards the end, whenever stuff kind of starts to go down, and the Harkonnen starting their kind of destruction of the Atreides and all that stuff. Most of the action is in Book 2, really. So we'll just kind of walk through the plot a little bit. It starts off with Paul and Jessica. They're in the tent still, hiding from the Harkonnen and the Sardaukar. Except now Paul is all-knowing, right? He's had his Matrix moment, right? He knows he's the one. And
he's aware of his abilities, and he's having crazy visions of the future and the past and different timelines.
Like, what do you think of Paul being this crazy, like, God-type character?
Well, I think it's pretty cool, but this is one thing I thought was really... I was like, how would I be in this situation? So you have Lady Jessica, who's obviously the mother of Paul, and she's been training him, raising him, and now all of a sudden, her son is probably the most important person in the universe, with his abilities and everything. And so she sees this shift, and she's like, my son is Space Jesus, basically, like we said last week.
Right.
And so that's got to be a crazy, shift and mental shifts. It's not just your son. You now have this importance with him, but then also Paul, he's this kid. I mean, he's 16 years old, and then he all of a sudden he now has these crazy, insane abilities to see the future, and in these futures he's seeing that basically he joins up with the Fremen, and they start doing space jihad and are taking over the universe under his name. Yeah, and so it's cool. I mean, we'll get a little more into it in a little bit, but he has this pressure. He's like, I really don't want that to happen because that really is terrorizing the universe, and that's not what I'm about.
Yeah, he's like the leader of a crazy, like, holy war. Like, they literally call it a jihad. Yeah, so he doesn't want that to happen. And then what happens is the Harkonnen and the Sardaukar are battling the Fremen and what's left of the Atreides house. You got some of these side characters, Thufir Hawat, who ends up being captured by the Harkonnen. And, I kind of wanted to mention the Sardaukar, right? So the reason why they're important is because, like we said in the Star Wars episode, they're basically stormtroopers, right? That means they work for the Emperor. So basically, it turns out that the Baron is allied with the Emperor. So it's not just the Baron that wants the Atreides house to fall, but the Emperor himself wants that to happen. So that comes into play, especially in Book 3. So what happens is Paul and Jessica are scooped up by Duncan Idaho, who's the sword master of the Atreides household. He's actually being played by, what's his name? Aquaman.
Jason Statham?
No, Jason Momoa.
No, it's almost the same guy.
Jason Statham's the, you don't want to mess with me, bruv. Like that.
Crank?
Yeah, Crank. That's you knew who that was.
That was a terrible impersonation.
Yeah, so they get scooped up by Duncan Idaho and this dude, Kynes. He's like the planetologist, the guy who studies the planet, but he also works with the Fremen. And he's also like kind of this religious leader of the Fremen as well. And so they team up, they take them with them. But what happens is the Harkonnen show up. They kill Duncan Idaho and Kynes. But anyways, Paul and Jessica escape in a sandstorm. So you get a large chunk of Paul and Jessica wandering through the deserts. Some sandworms are chasing them.
Yeah, but you got to talk about how they avoided the sandworms. I thought this was very interesting. So they can't walk on the surface as like normal people because the sandworms will be aware of, hey, there's somebody here, let's go eat them. So what they did, Paul gets what's called a thumper, and he puts it in this rocky area to attract the sandworms to that noise and those vibrations, while Paul and Jessica, they basically shuffled like they said they can't be in a normal pattern or the worms will know that they're actual people there walking. So they kind of drag their feet, and then they pause for a little bit. So what they're doing is trying to mimic the wind, and so it's just normal sand movement. And I thought that was really cool. And then, of course, the worms still show up, and then they freak out and run because it's a giant worm trying to eat them.
Well, in this part, Nick, you and JP, this is another thing that you got to do. But Nick, so what did that remind you of? What video game did that remind you of?
What video game? What?
The part with the thumper. Think about it. The thumper and the stuff that comes up from under the ground.
Sounds to me like Tremors, the movie with Kevin Bacon.
It is similar to Tremors, but so Nick, Half-Life 2. Remember that part in Half-Life 2? Whenever with the bugs.
Oh yeah. After that's after Ravenholm, right?
Yeah.
Oh man, I hate that place. But yeah, you get the thumpers, and that's like the only safe place. That's right.
Yeah, because so JP, that's another video game that you got to play at some point. Half-Life 2, one of the greatest games of all time. But
man, it's cool.
What, played on PlayStation?
That is going to be on
Xbox.
They had it on PlayStation, right, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, it's like on everything almost. You can play it on your phone now. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a pretty old game, but it's a classic. So they get picked up by the Fremen, and like this other group of Fremen, and their leader is this dude named Stilgar, and also Kynes' daughter, Cheney, is there, and Paul has the hots for Cheney. He actually dreamt about her, and he sees her, and he's like, ooh, I like that.
Not related to Dick Cheney.
No, not related to Dick Cheney, fortunately. But Paul like immediately sees her and is like, okay, that's the girl I remember from my dreams. And this is kind of cool. So the reason that the Fremen trust Jessica, right? Because remember, Jessica is like a space witch, right? Like she's got some powers, some Jedi-like powers. She's called a Bene Gesserit, and I thought this was a really cool tidbit. Is the Bene Gesserit apparently sent like spies to a bunch of different planets hundreds of years ago to basically spread myths, right, and prophecies. So a Bene Gesserit, like hundreds of years ago, comes to the planet and is like, hey, sometime in the future, a Bene Gesserit's going to come to your planet. She's going to be the savior of your race. So that makes them think that since Lady Jessica is a Bene Gesserit, that she's their savior. And so they trust her because she's got those powers. So I thought that was kind of a cool concept, you know? Like that's definitely long form strategy right there, right?
Yeah, playing the long game. And one thing I wanted to mention too, we kind of crossed over it. So when Paul and Lady Jessica escaped in that sandstorm, the Baron's forces saw that and they said, hey, they dead. Like, there's no way they could survive that storm. And so they reported back to the Baron and said, hey, they're dead. And so the Baron said, well, did you see a body? And they said, no, but nobody can survive that storm. And so Paul and Lady Jessica are presumed dead at this point.
It's a classic Lion King situation, right?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what I thought of when I was listening to this book. Is like, this is the Lion King.
Like, how are you gonna be like, oh, the desert's gonna kill them? Like, no, you get your ass out there and make sure they're dead. Like, that's classic villain mistake.
The Baron really wasn't a big factor in this story, I didn't think. In book 2, it was mainly about Paul and Jessica hanging out with the Fremen,
right,
and teaming up with them.
And that's the gist of the chapters. Is they're kind of, it's like the Last of the Mohicans, you know. It's like they're kind of becoming part of the native culture and all that stuff, so that they can turn around and fight against the the Imperials, basically.
Yeah, and was Paul challenged? So when Paul and Lady Jessica, of course, the Fremen are skeptical about them, like they shouldn't join us. And then who was it? Was it Cheney's husband or? Who challenged Paul?
No, so...
Was it Jameis?
Yeah, Janus. He's not Chani's husband because we'll get to his wife later. But so Janus challenges Paul, and they have like this little knife fight, right? And so the deal is though Paul doesn't realize that he has to kill him in the fight. That's the rules. So Paul ends up killing Jameis. It's a cool little fight scene. But Paul ends up crying for Jameis, and the Fremen are like, that just blew their minds that Paul is crying for Jameis because water is such a valuable commodity that the fact that someone's crying for the dead, they're giving water to the dead. What kind of person is Paul and all that? So, but they decide to accept Paul and Jessica into their culture, and this is kind of a cool little tidbit. Whenever a person dies, they basically drain all the water out of their body, like a raisin. Like they just kind of wring them out, I guess, and save the water for later. And actually, so Paul gets the water from Janus's corpse because he won the fight, and he also gets Janus's wife. Either Janus's wife is now Paul's wife, or she can be Paul's servant. So Paul decides to make her his servant. Crazy rules on Dune. Also, Paul decides to take a new name, or they want to give Paul a new name, so he calls himself Muad'Dib, after this rat in the desert, this little mouse thing.
But it's a very smart mouse because apparently it symbolizes wisdom and wit and everything like that.
Yeah.
And I know in our last week's discussion, we talked about, asked about who Princess Heirloom is and all that.
Uh-huh.
In book 2, maybe I missed this in book 1, but in book 2 you find out that the Emperor is her grandfather, right?
The Emperor's her father, actually.
I was wrong.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure. I'm like 90% sure. But yeah, that the Emperor's her dad.
But yeah, so you figured that out. And also one thing I noticed, so she always signs off with her stories saying something like the Muad'Dib, and you realize in book 2 that it's about Paul.
Yeah.
So, obviously she's chronicling Paul's life, right?
So you didn't realize that until recently.
Well, I figure, obviously she's telling this story of Paul, but, she's saying all these weird space words. I didn't know what she was talking about.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden Paul says, yeah, I want to be known as, he saw in his future, they were just saying he's Muad'Dib, and he said, no, I don't want that future, so he's Paul Muad'Dib.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I realized, the Princess Heirloom, or whatever her name is, she's obviously chronicling mainly all these sayings from Paul. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Okay. I guess kind of so the Fremen ended up taking Paul and Jessica to their city, Sietch Tabor, I guess. I'm not sure how to pronounce the the other word. But and meanwhile, Paul is kind of wooing Chani, and plays her a love song on his little mandolin thing or whatever. And the last part of the book is a trip, isn't it? Because they're turning Jessica into like the Reverend Mother, which is kind of like this leader figure of a Bene Gesserit, because it turns out the Fremen have a Bene Gesserit of their own on their planet. So they do this ceremony where Jessica kind of drinks this poison, and she has to turn it into water using her powers, so it's safe to drink. But then it becomes this weird like drug trip, like where she's like looking into her soul and stuff. It's really strange, isn't it, Nick?
Yeah, because so she's talking to the Reverend Mother, and she's like, man, she's this old bag talking to me about life and Dune and whatever. And then she drinks this juice, and then time around her stops. Like she looks around and says, why? Everybody's still. And then she hears a voice, and it's the Reverend Mother, but it's a youthful voice. And so she thinks, am I hallucinating this? She goes, no, you know this is me. I'm the Reverend Mother. And basically she says, it's because you're drinking this and your body was basically accepting the duties of being Reverend Mother, all the history of the Reverend Mothers and the wisdom are coming to you. And so that's how she gets all this knowledge to be the wise Reverend Mother. But then the current Reverend Mother says, wait, you're pregnant? And Lady Jessica goes like, yeah, I am. It's like, well, your kid's going to be kind of crazy now, because she's seeing all this
She's experiencing the same thing that Jessica is.
Yeah, and so it's like it's one thing for an adult who can kind of comprehend what's happening. They can kind of work through it, but now you have like a 3-week-old baby inside of you. It'll be interesting. And so they're like, yep, we'll find out what happens.
And 100%, like, this scene, I don't know much about Frank Herbert's personal life, but I feel like Frank Herbert was, like, really into LSD. And so that's what I like about the book, is that, it was written in the 60s. Like, it's got a bunch of, like, hippie-type ideas injected into it, which I think is a lot of fun to kind of think about. But that's basically how it ends. Oh, yeah, and Paul takes Chaney off to go do the dirty.
2 becomes 1.
Yeah, so to speak.
Or 2 becomes 3?
That too, I guess.
Yeah.
That does happen. Now that we've read and listened to 2 books of Dune, I think, and we obviously just got done talking about Star Wars in our other episode, I feel like there's so many similarities between Star Wars A New Hope and Dune. Obviously, the fact that Star Wars is on Tatooine makes it pretty obvious because they're both desert planets.
Uh-huh.
But even the relationships and the personalities of some of these characters, like Luke Skywalker, I feel like is the Paul character because, he's kind of thrust into this world that he doesn't want to be a part of, but turns out he has to be bigger than himself and save the universe, basically. And then you got the Baron, who's also compared to Darth Vader, and all this other good stuff. And there's just people trying to survive while a higher power is trying to keep them down. And I feel like there's a lot of similarities between Dune and A New Hope.
Yeah, for sure. So we didn't really talk about the movie adaptations of Dune that have been released, but there's one that was released in the 80s that I'd never seen, but apparently is really bad. But it might be fun to cover after we finish reading the book. And there's also like a couple of miniseries on Sci-Fi Channel that they produce that are pretty decent from what I've heard. But I'll be excited to see the new version since I really think that the new one's going to be good. But it's interesting that it does have a lot of similarities to Star Wars and a lot of other science fiction that has come out since Dune. So it almost makes you wonder if it'll make for a really good movie or if it'll just feel too familiar.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
It'll be fun to see.
Well, that's it for Dune Talk this week, though. We're going to finish the book for next week. Hopefully JP will be able to cram for it and catch up for it by then. But thanks again for listening, y'all. Again, check your podcast feed this coming Friday for part 2 of our Star Wars discussion. And also, again, this coming Sunday for our final discussion of Dune, and we're going to have to figure out what we're going to read after that. But that's it for this episode. Again, it's been a pleasure. We'll see y'all Friday.